My name is Dave Wilkinson. I'm a civil engineer and a town planner and a registered psychologist as well. My interest has been in mentoring people now, more recently, as I've got a little older. But I have been involved in quite a number of civil engineering projects because I operated as a civil engineer for something like about 30 years. And then as a development planner, town planner as well for some years, but then moved more into psychology. So I'm rather more involved now in psychology than in those other professions, but still retain the registration in those areas. The subject that will be speaking on today relates to what has happened in the last 15 or so years, a little bit more, maybe 20 years, in terms of our international competitiveness relating to organizations, government, parastatals, and what the author R.W. Johnson calls the dumbing down of these organizations. And this concerns me because it seems we're on a slippery slope. Things have been dumbed down. We've lost good people. We're not training up and using our human capital the way we could. There are ways that we can enhance our skills. We can enhance our ability to be trained. This is really going to be my main subject, that many people cannot be trained. They have trainability gaps, never mind skills gaps. So you can endeavor to train them in skills, but they're not able to receive it fully because of the disadvantages that they will have had. The first slide, and that is headed South Africa's dumbed down systems, and it says, South Africa, wake up and wise up, or continue to dumb down and die a dismal death. Okay, very dramatic statement. And then it looks at various aspects on that overhead, the educational situation, the parastatals, the government departments, municipalities. It looks at the sporting arena, it looks at the economy, and it looks at something which is of a concern to all of us, the degeneration of ethical and moral standards in the country. And I want to just address each one of those in turn, if we may. First of all, if we look at the educational situation, actually headed the Global Competitiveness Report, and that comes from the World Economic Forum, and 148 countries have been evaluated in that report. And it's very interesting because if you address that table that is on that slide number 2, you'll see that the top table relates to our competition, more or less the developed countries. And you've got there Canada, and you've got Germany, you've got USA, and you've got the UK. And where they stand in terms of the competitiveness of these 148 countries. Then underneath that, in the lower section of the table that we've got there, you've got the BRICS countries. And there, of course, those are Brazil, China, India, Russia, and the beloved country, South Africa. Okay. If you look at the scores there for maths and science, and remember this is ranked out of 148, the scary thing for me is that for maths and science, we ended up at number 148. Scary. Okay. If we look at the quality of the educational system, we did a little bit better. We only ended up at 146, but it's very, very frightening. Our educational system is not in a good way. What we want to address there is that what are people saying about the education? Now, we have such a hype going on about the improved matric results of this last year. Now, they're better than the previous year. But there's a very interesting article that was written by Rector Johnsons of the University of the Free State, where he says we're bluffing ourselves. Because it's not that the matric has got better and that we have better results, it's that the matric has got worse. So if you lower the standards, you mess up the standards, of course, then it's easier to perform. And he says, what kind of a result are we getting when a pass mark is 35% in matric? Is it a joke? I know that when I did my master's in America, pass mark was 80%. So this 35% is actually a foolishness. A Minister of Education said she's very happy with the improved matric results, and she said she accepts that the standard's gone down a little bit, but so many of us passing makes us feel better. Now, I don't want to feel better, I want us to be better. First of all, just let's look at Eskom. We know that they can't provide the peak demands that are necessary. We know that things are going wrong. When I was younger, in 1984, I had the privilege of working with Eskom. The firm I was with there had a contract to teach project management to their project managers. And when I looked at those people, they were excellent people, brilliant. There was a brilliant team of project managers that they had there. My problem now would be, when I look there, I don't find those men and women there anymore. They've gone. We've lost them. They've gone. Okay. And it's not surprising now that Eskom is struggling. It's just another example of the dumbing down of the parastatals. Johnson says, we must all decide whether Johnson's book is true, because obviously there are different opinions. And Andre Brink has done a very critical commentary on Johnson's book and questioned a lot of the facts and figures that he's given. But I went and I looked at them myself, and I did as much research as I could to check whether what he's saying is correct. And what I discovered is that sufficient for, at least for me in my simple mind, that he's right in his principle. The parastatals have been dumbed down. They most definitely been dumbed down. So I can't agree with Andre Brink's criticism of that book. I think he's right. We used to have wonderful parastatal organizations, excellent, world-class organizations. I don't believe we have that anymore. That's what Johnson's saying, and I can only say, amen, brother, I agree with you. If we then look at the next heading, which is the government departments, I was involved some time back as a mentor for a project that was training up engineers, town planners, and financial managers to be placed into municipalities. They were doing their internships with a view to writing their professional exams at the end of that time. And I had to be a mentor. I was put as a town planning mentor in Polokwane. Now, as I worked with these people, and remember my function was to ensure that they got the training they needed. And I had to then sign professionally, being registered as a town planner, that they had got that. It needs to be supervised as a mentor from somebody who's registered and has that right to say, yes, they've got the right training. When I looked at what was happening in that department, and this was provincial housing department in Polokwane, I was appalled. The people were not in their offices, people were missing, those that were there seemed to be doing nothing, and those that were not in the offices, I checked up on it, they were not out there doing work. So almost nothing was being done in that department, and that's a criticism. Maybe I'm being politically wrong to say that statement, but it's the truth. So I complained. The person that was in charge of the town planners for this project came, and she went around and she looked. She's a very senior town planner herself, and it was her job to monitor and see that this whole project was going well for the town planning people. She looked and she was appalled, just as I had been. And she took photographs. She's got a record of all of this that I'm talking about. Now, what happened was I complained and nothing happened. So I complained more bitterly and nothing happened. Because when I would come and speak to the interns and say, well, what did you do this week? This is the answer I got. Oh, this week we Googled and we ate buns, you see? Now, and that was the truth of it. They were doing nothing, getting no experience. So I complained, because professionally I can't then sign their portfolio of evidence that they've had training if they're not getting it. Now, there's a very simple solution to these complaints that are being presented by this fellow, and this is the solution that they put in place. They simply fired me from that place. Okay, now I remained in contact with some of those interns, and I found that nothing changed. They went to somebody else. I didn't speak to that person, but nothing changed. They got no experience. Now my question is, don't we want to train our people? Don't we want to have them effective and efficient? What's going on here? Sad. If we look at the next heading, it relates to municipalities. Now, in 1991, I had a job, actually. It was a part-time job with the Department of Johannesburg Municipality called the Water and Gas Department. Now, this was a very well-run organization. I was most impressed with them. The thing that I was most involved with was something called Unaccounted for Water, UAW. And for those of you who are involved in water know that that is the percentage of water that is wasted or can't be accounted for when you take the volume that's purchased and you take the volume that's paid for, the difference between the two, and you work out a percentage. Now, the percentage when I joined in 1991 was somewhere between 10 and 11 and improving. Good. It was a good international standard. Now, by the time I left, and I was there for 10 years, in 2001, that UAW had gone to 45%. Now, when I then look at Johnson's book and I say, has this dumbing down occurred? That's evidence that says to me, yes, it has, because I saw it myself. Okay, so it's very sad, very difficult, very, very difficult. And what happened soon after I joined was they divided the municipality into 4 regions, 4 metropolitans: Northern, Metropolitan, Western, Eastern, Southern. Then later on, when that wasn't working too well, they reconstituted the council into one, the Metropolitan Council, and they split up a lot of the functions into companies that were owned by the council. And water, gas was sold off, but water was put in together with sewage as Johannesburg Water. Now, I haven't dared to go and find out what their UAW rates are. It scares me to even think about that. But the dumbing down is there. It's happened. It's a reality. Okay. Let's then have a look at the next thing on overhead number 1. That talks about the sporting arena. Now, soccer is a good example of dumbing down, as far as I can make out. It looks as if there's very poor management in it. It looks as though there's huge allegations of corruption. And it also looks as though there's very, very little self-belief that we have in our soccer. So soccer has failed. And this is our national sport. This is the sport that most people are involved in if you take a proportion of the population. Now, if you look at cricket, we haven't done too badly there. That's a good example, a great example of what the Rainbow Nation is capable of when we work together. Because there are all different races and colors in there, and when they do well, they hug each other and they enjoy each other and they're happy together and everybody supports them. That's what we can do. Okay, and it excites me. If you look at rugby, it's a close second to that. It's not doing too badly. Okay, and the thing about rugby is the emblem of the Springboks was such a matter of national pride. Now, politicians wanted to take that away. And Madiba, bless him, said, no, we're not going to give up the Springbok emblem. And what has happened with that is that I believe one of the main reasons why we do so well in rugby is that we are so proud. We are so behind it. The nation is behind that, and we're excited when we win. If we then look at the next overhead, it's got the economy. Now, I'm not an economist, but slide number 3 is extracted from work that I've been reading on and so on. And what that shows us is that if we look at the years, and it goes from 1980 to a 2015 forecast, it shows it doesn't look too bad in general if you look at it. If you see the GDP in US dollars, there's good growth in that. If you look at the per capita income, there's good growth in that. However, when you look at the rand to dollar exchange rate, it's frightening. Now, it started off in 1980 at 0.8267, so the rand was worth more than the dollar then. It then ended up in 2010, which is as far as the stats go, at 7.462 rands to the dollar. We now know that that's close to 11. It's about 11. What is happening? We're printing more money and it's becoming worth less and less and less, and it's a very poor commentary on our economic status. It scares me. If you look at the unemployment rate, in 1980 it was 9.2, and in 2010 it was around 25%. The prediction is that it will get a bit better. We hope so. But it does look as though we're on a slippery slope, and the one thing about these increases in the GDP and the per capita income that worries me is if you compare ourselves with our competition, they're catching up, and soon they're going to overtake us. And that's what worries me about the economy. If we then look at the last aspect, it's headed the ethical and moral degeneration. This is hurtful. This is worrisome. All of us know about the tenderpreneur debacles that have happened, and we all have personal experience of seeing this happen. What I've referred to on that overhead is an article that was written by a person called Peter Allwright. I don't know him, but I like the article. He works with Horizon Forensics, and this is what he said in that article. He said, the financial misconduct in the public service has become an established practice with an increase of 346% from 2008-9 to 2009-10, and a further increase of 296% by 2010-2011. It's frightening. It's frightening. He then says that there seems to be no meaningful consequences to financial misconduct. But then he puts forward 12 arrangements to redress this crippling situation. I'm not going to read them all to you, but one of them he puts forward. The first one is the commitment of leadership to combat financial misconduct. And he goes through things like strict enforcement of the legislative framework which is in place, blacklisting officials found guilty, recovering money from unauthorized expenditure and things like that. There are 12 of these things. And I look at that and I say, brother, I couldn't agree with you more if only this were like that, but it's not. And this is the only way to combat this moral degeneration. There must be accountability. There is no accountability. Others are saying it, I'm just quoting them. Okay. When I was working for, I can't tell you who it is for, because I'm not allowed to put out these statistics, and I'm not allowed to perhaps criticize this particular organization, but it's a very important government-owned organization. I suppose you'd call it a parastatal. I was working for them to upgrade skills trainability levels. And just for an example, we had a literacy program. And in that literacy program, the idea was to give these youngsters 10 books to read. And those 10 books were very carefully selected because they were self-improvement books, ethical books, ways to become a better employee, a better person. And our idea there was to let them read the books. That would help their literacy, very important. And also then to take from each of those books what they've learnt about becoming a better person, about ethics, about morals, and so on, and to write a little essay on it. Now, what actually happened, and I was very hurt by this, was the person in charge of that said, yes, this is nice to have, but it's not an essential, so we're not going to do it. So it wasn't done. So you know, our attempt to address it at a grassroots level, this ethical and moral degeneration, is not seen as being important by management of that organization. This is a very significant organization I'm talking about. I don't want to focus, and my message isn't to focus on the dumbing down. My message needs to be, well, what do we do about it? How can we correct, how can we use our human capital better? If we look at this overhead number 5, it's headed improving trainability and individual performance. If we then go on, this is the slide that defines the problem statement. Okay, now what what it starts off by saying is, and this is a research that was done by Brooks Gunn et al. There's other people and the reference is there. And what they've looked at is the fact that poverty and social deprivation hinders the optimum development of a person's IQ. There's no doubt about it. Okay, they've looked at that, and then they look at the consequences of that. So people who are deprived socially, who have poverty issues, are going to not realize their full potential IQ. No doubt about that. Now, we can fix that. Maybe not 100%, but we can certainly fix it, at least 80, maybe more. And so we can improve the abilities of our human capital by addressing this particular issue. Okay, even after they've been through this poverty place, even after they've had the disadvantages at an age when they're in their 20s or 30s, you can even address it then. Now, the second thing that we were talking about here is, and this is the Vieda and Kampf document that is referred to, they say, and they make it very clear in their research, that lowered IQ, so we've got this lowered IQ, but they say lowered IQ equates to lowered productivity, no doubt about it. And we're going to look at this productivity formula just now and see that. The other one that we've got there is an article by Pechtel and Pizzagalli. They're from Harvard University. What they have done is they've taken all the research on people that have suffered early life stresses and the negative effects thereof. They've looked at that very carefully. So what are the consequences of having these early life stresses? And we're going to look a little bit at what they say. Okay, shame states and the learned helplessness and the demotivation and the disablement that comes from that, which is covered in a book which I've referred to called Mindsight by Siegel. We'll also look a little bit at that as well. We need to decide whether these lowered South African educational standards that are talked about, especially by Johnson and now by Rector Janssens at the Free State University and others, whether they're being unreasonable or unfair, but clearly those lowered educational standards leave people untrained and untrainable. No doubt about it. But we can fix that, even after matric. So you get a bad matric, it can still be fixed. And we'll try to show you some of the measures to do that. Okay, now what I'd like to just to summarize that problem statement is that all of these above lead to lowered productivity, there's no doubt. Lead to lowered productivity individually, in organizations, nationally. It damages our GNP and it perpetuates the cycle of poverty. There's no doubt about that. This is headed the performance equation. What you will notice in the references, I've given a reference of work by Cantor and Shelton, and they express this formula in a slightly different format than what I've put on the overhead. But I've put it on the overhead in this format because it's very easy to understand and it's quite commonly used. What it says is performance P is equal to abilities A multiplied by motivation M multiplied by the environment E. Okay, so it's the product of these three. All must be in place as we mentioned before. Now the main categories of abilities are IQ or intelligence quotient, and there's a whole massive debate about how that should be measured, and of course the debate is correct. You can measure it very badly, and we used to in the old days measure it. It didn't really make too much sense. They've got it better now, and people like Goldman, who did his work in the late 80s and the early 90s, he developed 7 intelligences that he mentions, and these are verbal intelligence, mathematical logical intelligence, spatial intelligence, and if you want to be an architect or something, you need good spatial intelligence, kinesthetic intelligence, and dancers would need that for movement and so on, musical intelligence, and then he had the last 2, which he called the one interpersonal, that's the ability to interact with people, or people skills, and intrapsychic. Now the intrapsychic is what's inside us, my self-worth and all of those things. Now obviously The EQ that they now measure and they bandy about as the emotional quotient is actually the sum or the net effects of how good you are interpersonally and intrapsychically. Okay, so that's what it's actually measuring. All right. Okay, so what we're saying then is that we need to be sure for these abilities that our IQ is good, our EQ is good, the self-knowledge, the acceptance, the worth, which is the intrapsychic, and then our people skills, the interpersonal, that are good, because that's what we would call the emotional quotient. And then the third one we look at is, we call it spiritual quotient. But really what it is, it's not am I a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Islamic or whatever, anything like that. It's related to more abstract things like a love of nature, an ability to meditate, an understanding of purpose in life, but a purpose that releases joy in me and fruitfulness in me and in myself, but also in others. So that would provide prosperity if we were all like that. I wish we were, that we cared about others as much as we cared about ourselves. Okay. Now some see that as being grounded in an intimacy with a higher power. And of course my own religion sends me there because I believe in God and I worship God and I believe I can have a relationship with God. Not everybody believes that, and I wouldn't judge anybody who doesn't. But SQ, spiritual quotient, isn't just being a Christian or a Buddhist or whatever, anything else. It's all those other abstract things which make life so joyful and so purposeful, and how we care in kindness for others and so on. Okay, now the second aspect of this performance equation, the motivation. To be motivated, first of all, we need to know what we want to achieve. We need to have goals. Now, not only do you need to know what you want to achieve, you need to know what has to be done to achieve those goals. You need to be very well informed on that. Then you need to believe that you can do those things that need to be achieved. And then you need another aspect, and that is that a support system, that if it gets tough, they'll stand alongside you, help you through that, and you'll be able to achieve what needs to happen. And that's what needs to come into motivation. And if we do, then our people will be more motivated. Okay, the last one is the environment. Now, if people have come from a damaging, traumatic environment, and we'll see this in the Pechtel and Pizzigali thing, article, they're going to be damaged. They may end up with a condition that we call post-traumatic stress disorder. But they can be healed from that. Now, we'll look at the costs of all of this, and that can be a little costly because it requires counseling and various other things that can be done to do that healing. But for a company, if they are in cahoots with their staff and doing this together, can use that person's medical aid to pay for that. Okay, so we're talking about then if you come from this very hurt background, we need to take action to heal it, and then the costs of that counseling that would be necessary can be paid for through medical aid. So it needn't be an impact specifically on the company if the firm is working together with the individual. And when a firm works in that way together, in their EAP arrangements that they've got, if they work together with that individual, the individual feels cared for, and it has a good effect. We also need to look at how safe and secure their present environment is, because if they come from an environment where they've been safe and they've been secure and they've felt significant, they're going to come out with very little trauma, very little damage. If they've come from that environment where they didn't feel safe or secure or significant, they're going to be damaged. But also the present environment can be very much against them. When I look at some of these folk that have to get up, early in the morning just to get to work on time, and I just have to walk 10 paces because I work from home, it's just not fair, is it? That I've got it so easy and they haven't. So their environment is very difficult, and they may not have the facilities I've got. They may not have lighting that I've got. They may not have all the wonderful mod cons and ease of life that exists for me. So when we're looking at environment, we have to look at the environment they've come from and the environment that they're in. Now, if we have good abilities, if we have good motivation, and we have good environment, we have good performance. Bad in any of those areas, limited performance. Okay, the cycle of poverty. Now in that, they talk about the poverty syndrome in this little graph that you've got there. Well, it's not a graph, it's a table, I suppose. And then it says there are three, as it were, contributing things to that we've highlighted. One is malnutrition, people who come from a place where they're not fed properly. You're not fed properly, your brain will not grow properly. And it's simple, but it's tragic. However, a lot of that can be rectified, even later on. The early life stresses that we spoke about with Bechtel and Pizzigali's article, if you've had those, the poverty syndrome place is full of those problems, massively full of those problems. And those folk that come from disadvantaged homes are going to be experience so much more of that trauma. So that contributes too. The third one on the top line is the cultural deprivation, and we know that the link with the places of origin, their tribal customs and so on, have largely been broken. Some of them are still there, but it's a mixture and it's confusing because now it's being offset and influenced by Western society and materialism and everything, and it's very difficult, very difficult. So these young folk are very deprived culturally because they don't know which one to align to, and there are inner conflicts, and it's very difficult. So we are a culturally deprived people if you think of it in that way. Okay, what then happens is, with those three things, the malnutrition, the early life stresses, the cultural deprivation, the central nervous system, the body and the brain are damaged, there's no doubt. Because the brain sees something scary, it sends a message to the body, and there's an area called the hypothalamic adrenaline axis. There's no exam, so you don't have to remember that, but it sends to there, and the body mobilizes, and cortisol is produced, and anxiety sets in. And if that's not dealt with, and gym helps, of course, but if that's not dealt with, it will damage the mind. It will damage the brain and the body, and the immune system will go down. Okay, so these people are being damaged because of their background. So what then happens is there's a lowered intellectual performance. And we know that if you measure that, you'll measure lower IQ, you'll measure lower EQ, and you'll measure lower SQ. And that is going to mean poor work performance. Okay, if you look at the poor lowered performance, that equates to poor income. If you then look at the poor income, it's just a continuing cycle of poverty. Learned helplessness will come, changed in the individual, and that cycle of poverty just goes on and on and on. Let's go and have a look at the negative effects of early life stresses as summarized with all the research that Bechtel and Pizzigali have put together. And they say, they detail a number of early life stresses and the effects that these early life stresses have on cognitive and emotional abilities in the brain. Okay. They then talk about these early life stresses, and it's a little bit of a euphemism because it really means abuse. The person's been abused. And they look at emotional abuse and what effect does that have. They look at physical abuse and what effect does that have. They look at sexual abuse and what effect does that have. Then they add in something which in psychology we call attachment deficit. Now, attachment deficit is lack of caretaker bonding. The parents were not available in the way they needed to be, so that interaction between the parents and the child has not taken place. And it's very interesting that UNICEF, they have said, that's United Nations, and they have said that the biggest problem, social problem that we have in our current age is the absence of fathers. Okay, very interesting. And that's borne out by this research that has been done. It's attachment deficit. We don't have that interaction. Now, why does it cause the damage? Well, first of all, the brain develops, and we spoke a little bit about that, by being stimulated in relationships. If the relationships are not there, you don't get that stimulation. It's like in rugby. When you're in a scrum, use it or lose it. Okay. If you don't use the brain, you lose it. Okay. Then the deficits in caretaking cause educational limitations. Either that parent is not able to, for their own lack of education, to help the child, or they're just not there. Because the problem is that, and I've seen this in certain work that I've done with populations that I've been trying to help, the problem is typically the man comes, drops his seed, pushes off, she's left holding the baby, she has to raise the little child without any help from the father. So the father's absent, he's gone, and UNICEF has pointed out the dangers of that. Okay. The other deficit that is there is it's usually accompanied, this situation, by poor nutrition. So they don't get fed fully or correctly, so the brain suffers because it's not being fed. It needs food to prosper. Okay. And then of course what will happen is there's going to be a lack of motivation in that individual, because there's no reassurance of personal value from a mother, from a father. And what we need to be telling our kiddies, and this is the most important thing, is, hey, you're a beautiful little girl. I'm so lucky to have you as my daughter, and I love you. And to the guy, but you're so strong, you're a big man. And these things, because that gives them motivation, because they believe in themselves and their self-worth is grown. So in these traumatized places where the parents are not present, they're absent, all of these negative effects happen. Terrible, sad, eh? Let's look at overhead 10, and that's headed shame states and learned helplessness. And obviously those shame states are the negative beliefs a person holds about themselves, and it comes from all kinds of traumatic experiences they may have, not getting enough food, being laughed at school, being emotionally abused, maybe at home, whatever. But these shame states manifest in many ways, and some of them are very conflicting ways. What can happen is that there's a sense of disentitlement and a sense of lack of personal worth. I have no value, I'm not worth anything, I'm not entitled to anything. Okay? And then demotivation and a feeling of helplessness will manifest in that person. That's one end of this continuum that I'm going to try and represent here a little. Other people will react with anger and aggressiveness to what has happened to them. And they then have a false sense of entitlement. So they're on the other side of the continuum of disentitlement, entitlement continuum. The world owes me a living, you see. You've robbed me from my birthright. Now I'm going to take it back from you, you see. Okay, whatever end of that continuum they're at, it's not going to be a positive outcome. Okay, and if we look around now, many people in South Africa find themselves at one or other end of that entitlement, disentitlement continuum. And much anger has, and much anger will continue to be expressed because of this. You can see this happening now in our country. People are getting fed up. Let's move on then to overhead number 11, and that is, how do we quantify these skills? How do we quantify these trainability gaps? And we've put down a means to measure these main deficits. And I want to just say to you that I was involved in a project. Can't say who it was because I've asked for permission to publish these results and asked for it 4 months ago. I haven't had a response. But we had 183 people we were training up. And I said, these people have trainability gaps. And we need to rectify that first. First of all, they said to me, "You're racist," because most of them were black folk. I said, "No, I'm not a racist. I ran away from apartheid and I came back. I don't have to live here. I can live I've got citizenship of New Zealand, and I can go to live in Australia if I want to. All my rest of my family live there, but I'm not packing for Perth. I want to be here because I want to make a difference." Okay. So anyway, I was accused of that, and then fortunately, some of the people who were in management there, black folks, said to me, "This man's not a racist. We know him. What he's saying is probably true. Let's give him an opportunity to illustrate whether what he's saying is true or not." So we tested these folk, and these are the tests that we used. And what we found and I'll run through these tests for you. All right, so I'll go back. So the first test that we used was a numeracy and literacy test, the differential abilities test, which is a matric-based one. But remember that these folk are now 9 years older on average than the matriculants, and they've got 3 years more training at a tertiary level. So you'd expect them to do better. Now the results came out, and it's measured with a thing called a stay-9. Now stay-9 just means there are 9 measurements or 9 grades. Now measuring these people on this matric-based test, one would expect to at least get average or above average, because they're going to be professional people being trained, for middle management eventually. So you'd expect them to do at least, maybe a 7, say 9, but at least a 5. Now, when I took all of the results that I had and I added them up together and divided by 183, the average score, which is not a particularly clever measurement, but the average score for literacy was 3.2. Frightening. It was much worse than I thought it would be low, but I didn't think that low. The average score for numeracy, now remember that approximately half of these people are engineers. Okay? The average numeracy was 2.8. It's frightening, eh? It's frightening. Talk about dumbing down our educational systems, but they all have national diploma or a higher national diploma or degree, all of these people. Okay, anyway, so that was the one we did, and we test them for that, and we would want them to have at least a level 6, 5 or 6 on that stay-9, if they would be at post-matric level, at that advanced level. Okay. The second one we use is called the Apple test. The Apple test measures a person's ability to think conceptually and to think analytically. A very good test. Excellent. Basically what it does is it teaches you, and it's not done, you don't have to be able to read to do it, because it's all done with little symbols and so on. So you can take an illiterate person and you can do this testing with them, as long as they can recognize a boat in a drawing or something like that. Anyway, this would measure their ability to memorize, the ability to understand novel ideas, to absorb and understand those novel ideas and apply it to a new situation. Okay, they understand concepts and they can do analysis. Right. Now those tests are linked back to SAQA levels, and originally they were linked to 7 SAQA levels, but of course now there are 10 SAQA levels. But the results came out for this group, the same group of 183 people, came out 70% of those people were at SAQA level 3. Now 4 is matric, so what are they? It's grade 8. 10% of them were at grade 2, SAQA level 2. That's a skilled pick and foshel person. Okay? Only 5% of them were at SAQA level 5. Now we absolutely needed 5 as the benchmark that we would be using. So this was a disaster. These people cannot think conceptually and analytically. How can you make them into managers? How can you? I was flabbergasted at the results. I was so shocked. Okay, I expected them to be poor, but not this poor. Okay, for the planning and the application of planning, we used a thing called the Maze test. Not a perfect one, but it does give you a pretty good measure of it. For this group, this educational and age group, their level should have been, their score should have been at 23. Average, 6. They cannot plan. You couldn't give them anything to plan, they won't succeed. Okay. However, we can fix it. The other test we did was MCMI, Millen Clinical Multi-Axis Inventory Test, and that indicates a person's emotional wholeness. And on that test, and using another thing called a personal lifeline, which is a measure of your history or a story about your history, we can see whether a person is emotionally whole or not. Approximately 40% of these people are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and need to be healed. If they're not healed, they won't realize their full potential. No way. Measures to correct trainability gaps, that's number 12. If they have a poor Apple level, then there's a program called CogLab, which is also developed by Terry Taylor. If you process people through that CogLab program, it will raise the SAQA level definitely 1, even maybe 2. So those of them that, depends on their background and so on, but those folk that I was working with who were at a level 3 and should have been at 5, there's hope that doing the CogLab they may even get to 5, but they'll definitely get to 4. Okay. Literacy, that was one that we needed to do. We give them a little course on communications and reading, and then we want them to, whatever their STAIN-9 level was being on the DAT test, we would want them to end up perhaps at 6. Numeracy, we'd also need to do that and give them a course on numeracy. We'd also want them to end up at that level of about a 6. But they need that numeracy course. Okay. Now the literacy, the most important part of the literacy course is that reading of those books that will teach them so much about how to be a better person. So I'd hope that anybody that goes on a thing like that doesn't say, that's a nice to have, we're going to exclude it. Because it's not a nice to have, it's essential. Okay. All right, with planning, we believe that people need to be taught a number of things. Some of them may have it, but I don't know their depth of understanding of it. But the things that we have in our little planning course is we teach them a work breakdown structure. That's a process which is well known by project managers to plan a project. So these things kind of hang together. The CogLab hangs together with an understanding of this. We then also believe they need to be taught critical path. That's what order is the work that needs to be done and how long will each task take, and which must happen before another can happen, and so on. And yes, they're also taught in some courses, but they need to understand it deeply, and so we want to give them a deep understanding of that. The other thing is, we call it the Delphi matrix process of managing a group. So you get a committee, you get a group, and I used this once when I was working in Botswana, and we had a very diverse group. We had people from Parliament, we had town planners, and at that stage the town planners were from Sweden, so they were very smart cookies, these people. We even had Ian Kama, who was at that time in charge of the army. Now he's the president. Okay. But we had local farmers who were illiterate. We had such a diverse group of people, and you want to get their opinion and their understanding to them and from them. And this Delphi process is wonderful to do that, and we need to teach them that as well. Okay. And then the last thing, and this is relating to what happens and what do we do with people who have PTSD, and how do we fix the damage to the brain? What we do is we do a check with a thing called a qualitative electroencephalograph, and that tells us whether the brain has these problems. Okay? Okay. Now, the second thing we use is this thing called MindSight, which is work that Siegel has prepared, because that also renews the brain, teaches you to overcome anxiety, teaches you how to improve your interpersonal relationships, teaches you to think much more clearly. It's a wonderful process, and we teach them that as well. We also do the PTSD debriefing by going back to the trauma and finding healing for that. Okay. What we want, of course, is wholeness in cognitive and emotional abilities and a balanced brain is what we want to end up with that. And medical aids can pay for that. Well, that ends the little discussion. I hope it's been of use. I hope we stirred you up. And I hope that some people will react to it, because we can help people who have been disadvantaged in any of these ways, who are not able to be trained. That's the problem. So you can't give them skills because they're not able to be trained. And that's not a racialistic thing, because it's an international problem. It's just that we have a far greater problem in South Africa than most countries. Well, thank you, and bless you all.